Hello there. I'm very happy to be presenting today on alcohol policies, which is a topic that I think is extremely important and interesting, and I hope you agree as we go through it. So I want to begin by thanking my co-author, Diane Schmidt, and mention that the focus is mostly on U.S. alcohol policies, although toward the end I do talk a little about some of the more international issues. So much of the content reflects the work undertaken with the support of NABCA, and the NIAAA Center grant that we have at ARG. And I should mention that decisions for inclusion were ours and do not reflect the official positions of the supporting organizations, NABCA, NIAAA, and NIH. All right, so first I'm going to give you some overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to begin with alcohol epidemiology. The reason for this is it creates a kind of a backdrop of what the alcohol consumption is over time, trends in overall drinking. I'll talk a little about drinking patterns as well. And then I'll talk about some of the health and social harms just briefly before we get into alcohol policies, which I'll approach from a historical point of view to create a kind of cultural backdrop. And then I'll types and effectiveness of various specific policies. And I think that one of the things that is clear is there's been a huge amount of research in this area, and it's definitely a developing area. There's still research going on in this area. So I'll be presenting a range of findings from basically the 90s through the present. Alcohol policies generally aim to reduce the overall or per capita drinking, because there's strong evidence that suggests that if you reduce overall drinking, it will also reduce harms. And the pioneer of this approach, which is sometimes called the single distribution approach, was Ole Jürgen Skog, a famous researcher in alcohol studies. And when you change patterns of drinking, this also reduces certain harms, particularly acute harms. So this is also a focus, which is to change the patterns of drinking. So let me go to the drinking trends. So here we have a picture of basically the different components of alcohol in the US, wine, beer, and spirits. There are, of course, others such as cider, but they don't represent a very large portion of the consumption. And what you find here is that drinking peaked about in 1980. Then it fell through the late 90s and has begun to rise again since that time, rather slowly. And it's mostly owing to the increase in spirits recently and also a certain amount for the increase in wine drinking. Beer has actually been declining to some degree, relative. Again, this is the per capita consumption. So this is the amount of consumption averaged across people from age 15 on. And the reason it's age 15 is because there is quite a bit of adolescent drinking, and they attribute a considerable consumption to the sales from that age group. And you can see that in 2016, there were as many as 506 drinks sold for each person age 15 and older, which is really a remarkable amount when you think of it. It's well over, it's like a drink and a half on average per day. So that's a considerable amount. And I would mention that researchers have been studying what they call the long waves of consumption. And the general idea here is that society, when there is high consumption, experiences a good number of harms from alcohol. And legislators begin to tighten up on the alcohol controls, and then drinking falls. An example would be the minimum drinking age, which came in 1984. And this is the drinking age of 21, which came in 1984. And then as they tighten the controls, over time they begin to forget, because drinking goes down, problems tend to go down a bit, and the society tends to forget about the reason for the alcohol controls, and they begin to loosen the controls, and then drinking begins to creep up. And in recent years, there have been considerable relaxation of alcohol controls that seems to go along with some of this increase that we've seen in recent years. So let me spend some brief time on the alcohol harms that underlie some of the need for policies. So first of all, I want to mention that we really have both amount and high intensity drinking, and together in interaction, these result in higher risk of certain alcohol problems. And the problems themselves lie on a continuum and vary in type. For example, there's acute problems. This would include things like injuries. There's chronic problems, which are more like the health problems. And then there are secondhand effects or externalities. And I'll talk a bit more about this as we go through this. But I want to make the point that even lower risk individuals, people at a lower point on the drinking continuum, because there are more of them, give rise to a substantial societal toll. And this is a fact sometimes known as the prevention paradox, where in fact, people at a lower level of drinking contribute considerably to the societal toll total. So coming to the content of the slide itself, first of all, we have mortality and morbidity. So drinking increases the risk of chronic diseases, and there are many chronic diseases that are increased, which includes the liver cirrhosis, certain cancers, hypertension, coronary heart disease, and obviously also injuries and vehicular crashes. Even though those relate quite a bit to the patterns, but rates are definitely affected by overall intake, but they also relate to the drinking intensity or the pattern of drinking. When you come to economic costs, they are really quite considerable, and they way exceed the amount that's taken in by taxation. So if this was a rational world, taxes would be higher. That would in turn reduce drinking, but the revenues would become more sufficient to cover some of the economic costs. And people, by the way, have estimated that if you take into account the harms to others or externalities, the costs almost double, actually. So there's, I would say, room for states and jurisdictions to increase taxes, and that would help cover the costs. So in terms of alcohol use disorders, chronic alcohol consumption, and also to some degree acute alcohol consumption, does increase the rate of alcohol use disorders. And there's significant detrimental effects from simply having alcohol use disorders or dependence on alcohol. And some of the examples are suicide, co-occurring substance use, mental health disorders, depression and anxiety. It's an area that is being studied quite significantly in terms of individuals. Finally, when we come to harm to others, so adverse effects extend way beyond the drinker, and there are both social and health harms for others associated. That is to say, again, anxiety, depression in families, children being at risk, and even the community where the fallout from heavy drinking hits the community. Anywhere from public nuisance, police involvement, family disputes, this kind of thing. And financial problems. Today, it's not so much the cost of drinking that causes the financial problems, but when people are really chronically drinking to excess, they may make very bad financial decisions and they may lose their job. So it has very big effects on families in that way. So now I'm going to move on a little bit to some of the prevention framework here, and I'd start with prevention policies. And I'd mention most policies are aimed to reduce harms, but some policies actually can increase harms. For example, lowering taxes or not indexing them to the CPI, which is in fact always the case. or removal of a retail alcohol monopoly, as happened in Washington State, or the current decision to, for example, retain cocktails to go even after the pandemic. Some 18 states have legislated that cocktails to go is going to be continuing, and that is, you can go and pick up cocktails, which can be quite strong, and bring them home. So all of these things are likely to increase consumption. So essentially, policies can go in either direction. Relaxing them can increase consumption, and tightening up can potentially reduce consumption. But I would add that it's pretty important to think about vulnerable groups, because sometimes policy changes, even though they may appear to be in the right direction, may actually have negative effects on certain populations. And an example of this is that there was a strong push to get screening for alcohol problems into primary care, where a doctor would ask you a number of questions, and this would lead to being screened for whether you might have an alcohol disorder or be drinking too much. But oftentimes, ethnic minorities don't go to primary care. They either go to emergency care or don't have access to doctors at all. So in a case like that, they may be left behind, and the policy may be, in effect, ineffective and increase disparities. So this is something we are concerned with as well. So just to point out that policies appear at various jurisdictional levels: federal, state, county, municipal. They are legislatively based, but also involve law enforcement, random breath testing, the justice system in general. And certainly when people have multiple or even single alcohol-related crashes or injuries, it brings a certain attention to enforcement. And the problem often is that enforcement is one of the weak links. Even with the best legislation, unless there's enforcement to go along with it, it may not have lasting effect. Then we have various institutional and organizational policies: server intervention, school policies, workplace policies, and the military are all examples of that. And finally, international policies like trade agreements. So this is a very complex area at many different levels. And at the end, I'll be talking more about some other issues, including the policy environment and public opinion, and I'll give some thought to that. So a lot of work has gone on in expert groups to try to understand and assimilate the evidence and come up with the idea of what the best buys might be. And I would say that this slide makes it appear that we know enough, we do know a lot, to classify alcohol policies that are down on the left side with their effectiveness and the research support that goes along with them, and also whether they have been tested in a cross-cultural sense, meaning in different places, and whether they're costly to implement. So these are all issues of concern. And I would add that it's a dynamic picture rather than a static one, in that different evidence comes to bear and experts can disagree. For example, I've done a lot of work with warning labels, and I would not believe that they're completely ineffective. It says 0 here. I don't agree with that. Warning labels have played a considerable role, actually, and recently there have been some studies of warning labels involving cancer messages that have been proved quite effective. And also, warning labels may help people choose not to drink in certain situations. So it may not be the overall consumption, which they were talking about in this slide, but it may help you avert certain kinds of dangerous consumption. So warning labels can be an effective tool in my view, but this particular set of experts thought not. So let's go back to a little bit of history that's really important from the point of view of the policies that we have today. If we go back to the history of Prohibition, the first thing people don't know is that many states have passed Prohibition before the Federal Prohibition Act took place took effect in January 1920. These lasted to December 1933, so 13 years. And there were two stages in the impacts. The first stage involved a real reduction in drinking and drinking patterns. And you can see here in this little table that a number of positive outcomes occurred, major reductions in cirrhosis mortality, also hospitalizations for alcohol psychoses, and also arrests for drunken disorderly, which is something that had been very common. Perhaps it's a little less common today, but it was common then, and showed a 50% decline. And I would mention that suicides also were reduced. So this is something that early on was very successful as a policy. But in the second period, lawlessness and crime led to a kind of loss of legitimacy. And some of this is because people do, in fact, like to drink. And many people found ways of drinking that involved speakeasies and involved a lot of crime, basically, from the point of view of the federal enforcement of this act. So essentially, the elites led the way to repeal. So somewhat before repeal, Roosevelt campaigned for repeal of the 18th Amendment. And then in 1933, the 21st Amendment, which was the repeal amendment, was ratified by 35 states. So as part of this, alcohol control became a pivotal idea. And this is where states varied, and they were allowed to vary. There was federal regulations related to purity, for example, and reduction of spirits and wine to curb illegal production. And then at the state level, there were many different solutions to post-repeal enactments. All the states adopted a three-tier system. This was because prior to Prohibition, there had been this saloon situation in which producers owned the saloons, and that was believed to promote heavy drinking. So the three-tier system was set up, which separated producers, distributors, and retailers by law. And there were also, in some states, devolved powers allowing a dry option at a local level. But all states could opt for things like retail and wholesale monopolies or licensing. And so there are tremendously different numbers of solutions in the different states, many of which a major problem in terms of having workers, for example, consume a lot of their pay for drinking. And there had been very heavy consumption in the late 19th century. And when these policies came in, it was designed to avert some of the problems that had been there before Prohibition. So let's go into some of the specifics. I mentioned earlier age restrictions. Well, there were different states had different ages. For example, Michigan had an 18 or perhaps it was 19-year-old limit for purchasing alcohol, whereas right to the south, Indiana actually had a 21-year-old age limit. So a lot of students at colleges in Indiana used to drive up to Michigan to drink, and it was a very dangerous road because of people coming back to Indiana inebriated and heavily loaded with alcohol. So one of the things that the federal government did was enact a 21-year-old minimum drinking age act. And the way this was enforced was by tying highway funds to the state enactment of the 21-year-old minimum legal drinking age. And that was very effective. And within a very short time, all the states had a 21-year-old minimum legal drinking age. And this has remained in place subsequently. So this provided a very good natural experiment for researchers to study the effects, and they found it significantly reduced all kinds of problems among young adults, and even some of those over 21. The effects actually extended to people over 21. It cut the educational dropout rates, car crashes, crime, injuries, assaults, and even suicides. So this was a very effective policy, and it's remained in place as a result. There have been some attempts to roll it back, but they have been pushed back. So there are a number of alcohol controls related to the product. First of all, I'd mention that different alcohol types, such as beer, spirits, and wine, are taxed differently. And high-strength products like spirits tend to be taxed much higher. And some of that is rational in the sense that really spirits is much more able to cause alcohol poisonings and overdose deaths. So there is some rationale for taxing spirits at a higher rate than lower strength products. But then also these regulations affect the various sales. So there's some licenses that don't include spirits, and there's some that includes all products. There are labeling requirements, and there are also different strengths of wine and beer that are affected differently. And then you also have certain products like champagne, which are treated differently than table wine, as well as fortified wine being treated differently. And these things affect the prices of these different products as well. So it's clear that alcohol taxes are a way for governments to raise money, but they also reduce the social cost and harms of alcohol use. And one of the problems with taxation is, particularly the excise taxes, are not indexed to the consumer price index. And so the real taxes have fallen drastically over the years and have seldom been revised upwards. And as a result, the actual affordability of alcohol is really at an all-time low. It's cheaper than many of the other types of drink that doesn't involve alcohol. And as a result, we have generally increasing alcohol sales. One strategy that's of considerable interest is minimum unit pricing, or setting a floor price. This has been found in Scotland and British Columbia to be very effective, but no U.S. state has used minimum unit pricing. So it's an area that will be of considerable interest to work on. The idea is there are always products that are extremely cheap, and that means that somebody who's dependent on alcohol or a vulnerable group or doesn't have much disposable income can acquire alcohol at very low prices. So if you were to increase the floor, you would probably curb a lot of the problem drinking in some of the groups. I would say again, most of the action recently, a lot of it has been to reduce the excise taxes, but there are states that have increased alcohol taxes. The beverage industry tends to really fight any kinds of alcohol taxes. Taxes are often passed on to the consumer through price. That's why this focuses on price. So in terms of the product, there are these different ethanol contents, and they affect where alcohol can be sold, various advertising restrictions, less true today, and labeling requirements. And this is an area that is one of active study in terms of whether there are outcomes due to, for example, spirits consumption. People who drink a lot of spirits may have certain levels of problem that are different from people who don't drink many spirits. Let me go on to place. Alcohol outlets are one of the chief areas of study in terms of the reduction of outlets being tied to a reduction of problems. But that's also true for limiting hours, or actually, in some cases, increasing hours. So, for example, if you have 2 a.m. cutoff at bars versus a 4 a.m. cutoff at bars, can really affect the late night assaultiveness and harms in various communities. So this is an area that is important to look at. We see that privatization has the potential to increase consumption. And as it turns out, it also increases the price of alcohol, because in order to recoup the same amount of taxation, when a monopoly is unwound, as the case in Washington State, the prices to the consumer actually went up, which is contrary to what most people expected. And then I would also add that when you move, instead of to a monopoly situation, to a licensed situation or privatized sales, the ability to check on limiting sales to minors are reduced. So the area that is of considerable growing interest is really the area of promotion and advertising. Promotion occurs often in sports venues, and it's ubiquitous, and it's also seen then by children and minors. And it has been found recently that advertising and brand preferences, which is what the industry claims to be focused on, is actually having an effect on adolescents and young adults in terms of basically increasing their interest in consumption and changing their expectations about what to expect from drinking in a more positive vein, and obviously denying that there are problems involved, which young people tend to do. Moving on to the workplace. The workplace is a very important area because, first of all, there are considerable numbers of alcohol harms in the workplace. There are definite barriers remaining to enforcement around job-related issues. One of the kinds of harms we've studied is people filling in for people who have missed days of work, and we find that about 4% of absentee days are estimated to be due to own drinking. And strangely, a further 5% may be due to other people's drinking. Perhaps the person giving you a ride, or perhaps it's a home situation in which somebody's looking after somebody who's sick from drinking. Then there are also issues of different types of jobs, such as civil aviation, which has very stringent requirements. That may also be to some degree true of bus drivers, for example. And in some of the cases you have employee testing, in other cases not. And finally, you have various programs such as employee assistance programs. And I would mention, for example, the parity laws that have come in around mental health also affect addictions and health plans. And so moving people toward treatment is an important function that can be part of a job situation. If supervisors become aware of alcohol problems, they can use those kind of strategies, and that's a very important area for study. So moving on to finally some of the other policy issues. First of all, I'll talk about public policy opinions, and then I'll talk much more about policy environments. So first of all, one of the reasons for studying alcohol control policies is the notion that if the public is supportive of certain policies, that may A, help them get enacted, and B, help them get sustained once they are enacted. Legislatures are very sensitive to public opinion, and they're likely to be less excited about policies that have less support. So I'd mentioned warning labels as an interesting example, which we have studied, in which after the enactment of the Alcohol Warning Label Acts in 1989, steadily the support for warning labels increased, and people were very surprised by this because they had expected there'd be a boomerang effect and people would become annoyed by warning labels. But in fact, consumers appear to believe that, first of all, this doesn't restrict their drinking. It simply informs them of certain problems that they might want to be attentive to. So in that sense, it's quite supported. Another example is increasing money for prevention. Very well supported policy, and holding hosts liable for damage that might ensue from serving to inebriated people or serving to minors, for example, has proved quite effective as well, and it's quite well supported. But a counterexample is alcohol taxes, which are not in themselves very well supported, as you can see. A lot of these policies actually have been declining over time in terms of their support. With the taxation, if you tie taxes in people's minds to good purposes, such as increasing prevention or increasing treatment, people actually are more supportive of taxes in those frameworks. So how you frame the questions matters. And finally, I would mention that certain groups are more supportive of alcohol policies. For example, people who are quite religious are much more supportive of alcohol control policies in general. And ethnic minorities tend to be supportive of keeping alcohol out of corner stores, for example. And people who have been harmed by others are much more supportive of increasing taxes. And of course, people in recovery also support increasing access to treatment. So we're focused to some degree on what are the constituencies that actually are supportive of policies and might help champion them with legislatures. So I want to wrap up by focusing a bit on the issue of policy mix. And first of all, just to say that legislatures have this task of balancing consumer interests and, of course, not only that, but also commercial interests, which they're very attentive to, with the social harms and physical harms that come from heavy drinking. So governments have a balancing act, and that's not often something they're particularly attentive to. Usually they're attentive to one side or the other, and it's a difficult task to juggle these different points of view. It's very hard to get policies enacted. We have studied what surrounds getting policies developed and enacted, and it's a rare thing for legislators to move in the direction of tighter controls. It happens rarely. More often, they're in the business of relaxing controls, something that's particularly concerning in this post-pandemic phase. So then lastly, I want to talk quite a bit about state policy environments, which are bundles of alcohol policies, and often they're expert rated. And recently there's been a focus on creating alcohol policy scores, which are essentially weighted averages of policies as judged effective by various expert groups. And we have done studies of state policies looking at the restrictiveness of the overall bundle of policies. And this is a very promising area for research. So this slide shows some of the different levels of state policy. I mentioned that the higher scores are more restrictive in this arrangement, which just means the yellow states are more restrictive than the blue states, or the green, I guess it is, some shades of green versus the blues. And it can be that when you move from one state to another, you change the policy restrictiveness, like, for example, going from Colorado to Utah would be an example, or even New Mexico, changes considerably the level of the policy restrictiveness. And what's been found is that drinking and driving, binge drinking, and assaultiveness, these are things that the restrictiveness policy affects. And there have been now a number of studies suggesting that there's a really strong link between the overall restrictiveness of alcohol policies and many of these outcomes, including suicide, including drink driving, and it's an area that's of considerable interest and study at the moment. And the approach has been used internationally as well by rating countries' policies. And for example, one of our scientists has found that more restrictive country policies result in fewer alcohol-related injuries. So these are very important new tools. So finally, just to summarize some of the points that I want to bring out here, there are a very wide range of legislative policies, all at various jurisdictional levels, and they regulate alcohol commerce and people's drinking in the U.S. So in the last 30 years, policy analyses and evaluations have demonstrated efficiency of these policies and efficacy. Some of them are highly effective at reducing alcohol consumption and reducing harms. And one of the big issues, aside from implementation, is the degree to which there is a way of enforcing them, because this has been a real weak link for many years, that enforcement is weak in the United States. So we need both policies that affect the drinkers and also targeted harm reduction measures aimed at heavy drinkers. For example, developing different norms in situations. And some of that could be done in the workplace, some of that can be done in bar settings, for example, by training servers to cut off intoxicated patrons. Policy development studies really provide opportunities. When you look at how policies develop, you find that many different entities, from journalists to the public, are involved, and these provide us some opportunity to look at how to enact evidence-based policies. The global burden of disease has been studied recently extensively, and these and new surveys are leading to policy work that is choosing particular interventions, what you might call the best buys, in the US and worldwide. So I think the direction for the future is to look at the combinations of policies that might be most effective, not just an individual policy. So I want to thank you for your attention, and happy to have you contact us if you want more information. And again, I want to thank the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association, NABCA, which provided a lot of support for this kind of work. And there is a collection with an alcohol research summary available at the NABCA site that I listed here. And then what follows is a number of specific references, which I'm not going to go through, but which are available in this set of slides. So you should be able to access that and look at the various references if you want. So thank you very much, and I hope this has been of interest to you.